Johan Kugelberg, who has graciously invited me to a random forest, a reading room, a library, an art installation, which also is a library of rare and delightful
material possessions?
Material
or things
possessions.
that you can like look at but not own. So it's just like the internet, barely.
No.
No. Justin Lowe and Jonah Freeman, who we both admire greatly.
Adore.
Adore actually, for their art, for their thought process, and for their execution. About 5 years ago was when the idea of Random Forest started. And I was on the contributor list, but then it kind of didn't happen. So then when I hung out with these guys in Montauk, outside of New York, very fabulous, they asked me to get deeper involved. Ian and I are pals. Everything Ian writes, I love. And when you rock out on the stage, I'm most impressed. And we've been spending a lot of time together in the last couple of years, which is funny because we've been contributing to the same publications for like 20 years,
yes.
But we never met. What Justin and Jonah, the reason that we were brought into this is Ian, as I think one of the foremost independent authors of our generation, and also a great performer, and more important than that, a cultural thinker who doesn't suck at a time when some just might once in a while.
Well, thank you, Johan.
So the choices, this particular table that is the start, is about materiality, scarcity, and also commodification of cultural artifacts. The flip side of commodification of cultural artifacts is that they survive if they become commodities. So you can argue that you can fight commodification with commodification. So if we're going to start with this one, which is completely insane, is this, during the Baader-Meinhof activities in Germany in the 1970s, is the main text of the Red Army fraction of Baader-Meinhof, published in German in October of 1977, while they're still alive, while they're still active.
This is their manifesto.
This is their manifesto. And it's published with a fake cover. So the cover is just indicating a generic romance novel. It's called Prevented Love. The author doesn't exist. And then there's like a little romantic pictograph.
Incredible.
And the reason that that was done was so that it could be smuggled over borders at a point in time when it was a highly political text that, was like borderline outlawable.
So this was printed in the DDR?
No, this was printed in Sweden and smuggled into Germany.
Fantastic.
And it's also part of how rare books after World War II works. Because this was an impossible rarity until 80 copies were found in a storage space a couple of years ago. And that's also part of like how these things always happen.
So how many were made initially?
We think that the first run was maybe as few as 2,000 copies, and that most of them were distributed among political activists in Germany in like 1977,
Lebanon.
1978. So the books on this table have been chosen to illustrate materiality. And some of them are hellaciously expensive, some of them are cheap, some of them are culturally super important when it comes to like identity politics and subculture. So this book, for instance.
This is a surf book we're looking at.
This is Tom Blake's Hawaiian Surfboard.
Oh, groovy. What a groovy cover.
It's very groovy. The whole book is super groovy. He self-published this in 1938. And this is the first book on surfing. He hand stenciled all of the covers of this book.
Wow.
And it's impossibly rare. It's like ridiculously rare. And that also sort of, flips into identity politics versus, if I may use ugly language, sports. Mm-hmm. So if this would be the first book on, say, like American football or European football or ice hockey or baseball or some other terrible team sport, this would be hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
Because the fanaticism is there. But the weird thing about surfing culture is that the materiality of surfing culture isn't here yet even though it's something that's existed for over 100 years.
Because the sea water erodes everything.
Yeah, including the brains of the surfers, naturally. We're showing a few...
Wait, something more about this. So when he made this, was there, like, what was surf culture at that point? Was it still just this kind of...
It was a extremely manly, extremely like Dudley Do-Right, you know, they were called watermen. Like men who could like macho it up in the water and in the waves.
Tame the water.
And surfboards were so primitive that this was like, you know, surfing's insanely difficult, but it was like super insanely difficult back then. So it's a very small audience of like very macho dudes.
And was this in Hawaii or California?
California, and it didn't have national distribution. One of the interesting things with Tom Blake is that he was from New Jersey. He was from the Jersey Shore.
Interesting.
We are showing some books by the artist and photographer Ed Templeton, who is a friend of ours, because these are some of his most famous books. And they illustrate like the trajectory of like underground to like more well-known culture. So this is Ed's very famous book, Teenage Smokers, which was him doing a photo documentation of teenagers, you know, smoking cigarettes and looking cool. Ed naturally is vegan, doesn't smoke cigarettes, you know, none of that. But he is fetishizing these kind of identity politics. And the first version of this book was this zine, which was published in 1998 by a famous New York gallery called Alleged. They only made 100 copies. Then a couple years later, Alleged published the first book version of this. And this is, you know, now it's a rarity among photo book collectors. And then Ed sort of commodifies his own narrative. He does you know, the sequel. He does Sgt. Pepper Volume 2 or Velvet Underground and Nico Volume 2 with a bigger publisher, but it's called Teenage Smokers No. 2. So of course everybody's like, oh, I want number 1. Why can't I get number 1? And then Ed also comments on his own work by sort of defanging the situation by doing a book that he calls Teenage Kissers, which is rather sweet. Here's a book called Supernatural Strategies for Making a Rock and Roll Group.
Not rare and accessible to anybody who wants to start a rock and roll group.
And I got to get in the mix on this one now, because this is not rare now in 2022. Here, Ian, have a copy of your book.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
But it's also a bit of a masterpiece, I think.
Well,
it's published by a small independent publisher. You can't find it in like every airport and like every supermarket around the world, you know. If you're going to get the new John Grisham novel, you're not going to buy this by mistake.
No.
Which means that 50 years from now, some clown like me are going to offer this for sale as a great antiquarian rarity
hopefully
of the early 21st century.
If you have any tips on pumping up the value of, you know, the artifact value, that would be great. Well, then I'll squirrel some away.
Sometimes you can pump up the artifact value in the worst possible way, in like as terrible as it possibly gets. You've heard of this guy Bob Dylan, right?
Of course.
He's super popular. People are really into his jams. And apparently he got this prize in Sweden for literature.
Yes.
The Nobel Prize, which is very prestigious if you're an author of fiction, right?
Yes.
And a lot of people buy his records. And you know, some people imitate his dress code too. He's a very popular guy, Bob Dylan. So Bob Dylan's first novel is called Tarantula. And it was published in 1973, I believe.
67, I thought.
Nope. This was published in 1967.
Really?
And then Bob Dylan got mad at the publisher and stopped the publication when it had only reached the galley stage. So it was never published then. A very strange man named A.J. Weberman, who was a Dylan fanatic who is notorious for having gone through Bob Dylan's garbage and who Dylan actually punched in the nose at one point, got a hold of the galleys and made copies. And these copies, he made about 75 of them And then he walked around in the streets of the West Village selling these to people.
Wow.
So what you're looking at here is the true first edition of a major 20th century cultural figure who then went on to win the Nobel Prize of Literature. So the first edition of Dylan's first book is a scrappy, pathetic bootleg that was sold on the streets of the West Village.
Crazy.
So then you think, oh yeah, it must be like tens of thousands of dollars, right? It's not, because this wasn't common knowledge until like the last couple of years.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So people have only recently found out that this is actually the status of this first book.
Mythologizing
Yeah.
these things is a big aspect of it.
Yeah, no, that's completely mythologizing, but it is also that like relative scarcity kind of thing.
Yes.
You know, both you and I have been playing the situationist banjo for many years of our life.
Of
you
course.
Know. Initially, we were just fronting because we hadn't read the books because we couldn't understand them. But we really liked the slogans, and the slogans were truly lovely to spray paint on walls, and sometimes that impressed girls. You know, it was good stuff. Now that I'm ancient, you know, Ian is nowhere near as old as me, and we've read all the texts, and we've come to the conclusion that we fucking love those guys, and that Ralph Vaneigem and Guy Debord were right about so many things.
More right every day.
Yeah, by all means, more every day. You start getting fascinated by the publishing history of the Situationists. Guy Debord and Ralph Vaneigem are, of course, the guys who became like really, really well-known names of the founders of the Situationist movement. Another very important figure is, of course, Asger Jorn. And Asger Jorn was a super blue chip artist in the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
Really, really popular. And he was a Dane. He was an old anarchist. During World War II, him and his brother Jørgen Nash were both in the resistance in Denmark, in Holger Danske, and like literally like blew up bridges and stuff. So the radical thought of Asger Jorn meant that he sold his paintings for a ton of money, and then he used a big chunk of that money for Situationist publishings. So all of those legendary Situationist books that you've heard about, like Pour la Forme with the sandpaper cover, or Fin de Copenhague, where Jorn and Debord went and got drunk and cut up a bunch of newspapers and poured paint over them and then printed it as a book. All of that publishing history is still a mystery now, even though it's almost 70 years later. And this is how weird this aspect of bibliography is. This book is by Hardy Streed, who was known as the Situationist Superman, and who was one of the founding members of the Situationists up until he got purged in 1961. This is as of yet the only known copy of this book. There was no copies in his estate. There are no copies in any museums or any university libraries. And the book is completely and utterly bonkers because it's a total handmade collage book. If you go to the colophon page on the back, you can recognize that this stamp is identical to the stamps that were used for some of the other Situationist publications. It's listed here that it was an edition of 20 copies made in 1957, but then when you crack this thing, you just fall apart, because look, this is a handmade collage.
Yeah, and there's paintings in here.
And this is a handmade collage, and these are layered prints with collage components. So this is a completely handmade artist's book in a similar way to the artist's books that Justin and Jonah have selected on this table over here, and as far as the contemporary artist's book goes. And then in my trade, because I'm a rare book dealer and a curator, and I work with archives, I teach at universities. I'm a professor at Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. I've taught a master's class at Yale. I've been a visiting scholar at Cornell, like a bunch of nonsense like that. But when you look at something like this, an artist's book of this magnitude and of this importance, and then you find out that nobody knows about it, and it's like almost 70 years later, then you can't help but think how these things travel in time. And then you also land in thinking about like the mess that is digital knowledge versus knowledge in meat space. You must get this question. It's like, why are you publishing books? Why aren't you just doing a PDF? Why are you, you know,
Yeah.
why is materiality?
Well,
Why
it's
are you not just doing Zoom performances?
Well, books seem to be the one thing that's escaped the digital, like the kind of the destruction of the digital age. It's the one kind of material object that people still think is necessary. They've thrown out the records. They don't want to go to the movie theater, but there's something about a book that is that people are clinging to for whatever reason. Maybe because I don't know what it is.
Well, materiality is really complicated to think about in a time when we're just getting schmuckier and schmuckier with our smartphones. And that we think that, checking out a Wikipedia page means that we can say something pithy about Paul Bowles.
Yeah.
Or reading the headlines of, I don't know, CNN makes us think that we have a notion of what's going on in like a different country right now.
Yeah.
And that's the mirror which flatters not. Because one of the things that we constantly forget when we're grabbing this device is that it's not a portal to the world at all. It's a bullshit mirror that flatters us.
Yeah.
And that means that as we're looking into this, we're just choosing information that flatters us and we choose information that we want. But when you start like banging through this motherfucker, you're getting information that you don't want.
Yes.
And you're getting opinions that you don't want. And that means that you're also cross-fertilizing ideas that you didn't have before. And that is where William Gibson will talk about the difference between meat space and cyberspace. Because, check this out. What happened just now? I gave you something, and you took it, and you were stoked. And
An exchange.
Now what happened?
Here you go.
Yeah.
I don't need that.
Yeah, I really want it. This is totally killer. You gave me something back. There was an exchange that was going to lead to an exchange of ideas. And if you look at Justin and Jonah, who are multifaceted thinkers, in our humble and correct opinion, great artists, this room, which exists in meat space and which is bringing together extraordinarily disparate elements, artists' books from a contemporary American international art community, artifacts from history, some of them completely bonkers. Here's a copy of the Decameron in first edition. Boccaccio's filthy book written during the plague about what jerks, priests, and bishops and rich people are. When you experience all these materials together in meat space, you don't only engage with the ideas of you as an author, those guys as artists, me as a curator, but you also have the ability to fuse together thoughts inside of a random forest.